Good evening, everybody. I'd like to welcome you to this special Academy of Ideas public discussion, both to those of you who are here physically in the room and also those who are watching the live stream. This is a debate or a panel discussion entitled Ukraine in the Crosshairs of History. I'm Claire Fox and I'm the Director of the Academy of Ideas and I'm chairing tonight. I'd like to particularly thank, though, my colleague Ella Whelan for organising this event, who is over there and also organising the live stream as we speak. This event is partly inspired by an essay that's just been published by Professor Frank Furedi entitled The Revenge of History. It's just been published by Spiked online, which has been indispensable really at the best of times, Spiked, but it's been particularly important in the last couple of weeks for me. And I think they've really risen to challenge this crisis. Well, Frank is a prolific writer and world-renowned European public intellectual and author most recently of 100 Years of Identity Crisis. But also he wrote a book, First World War, Still No End in Sight. And what year was that, Frank? Was that 2014? So I read and enjoyed the book, but I can safely say I didn't understand its significance until the last 2 weeks. And then suddenly I thought, oh, I keep thinking about this book now. So it's always, it's unrewarding being an author, but lots of things about it resonate. So Frank's going to talk about some of the things, oh my goodness, so he's celebrating. We're on the brink of World War III. Party at the back, right. Frank's going to talk a little bit about that essay, the themes in that essay, which people can, if you haven't read it, because it's only just been published, you can digest afterwards. And then we're going to have some responses. We're going to hear from Tim Stanley, who's a columnist and leader writer at the Daily Telegraph. And he's the author of Whatever Happened to Tradition, History, Belonging and the Future of the West, which are actually key themes in Frank's essay: tradition, history and the future of the West. Key themes for this very moment, in fact. So it's very pertinent. I'm delighted Tim has been able to join us. He's a Radio 4 regular, as you'll know, on Thought of the Day and a regular on Radio 4's Moral Maze. And I did think that was appropriate because if anything feels like a moral maze, it's the situation we face now in terms of geopolitics, it seems to me. And then we'll also be hearing from Joan Hoey, who is Director at Europe at the Economist Intelligence Unit, where she leads a team of 15 analysts forecasting political and economic developments in 50 European countries. She personally is a specialist in the UK, Greece, the Balkans and Eastern Europe, and is also the editor of the EIU's Democracy Index. And Joan really is a specialist in Eastern Europe. She's also a very thoughtful contributor to events that we've had in the past, from the Battle of Ideas through to the Academy. So I'm delighted she's joining us. There are lots of big questions here tonight, aren't there? Is this just another war? Is it more of NATO interference? Is it just like Iraq or Libya, or are there greater consequences for geopolitics and the world order? I just made a joke about World War III, but we're hearing a lot of people talking about World War III. Is that just hyperbole? It's been described, this moment, as a violent return of history, and certainly the unresolved questions of power and territory that have lurked beneath the surface of society that many of us haven't even noticed have come back with a bang. And in just a couple of weeks, all those old certainties have been turned on their head. What we thought was the end of the Cold War, that it might mean the end of history and the era of permanent peace in Europe, is definitely gone away. And here we are, 30 years after the fall of the Berlin Wall, with a hot war at the heart of Europe, it seems. So I think that's thrown a lot of people, certainly thrown me. And that phrase, all that is solid melts into air. It feels like that, all change, and yet it also feels like that without the progressive dynamic, and that everything's turned on its head. So my plea to us all tonight is that this is a work in progress. I'm sure that the panelists have got a clearer view than I have. certainty of what's going on. But what we've asked them to do is to give us some food for thought. We're then going to discuss it. Frank's going to do a 15-20 minute lecture. Tim and Joan are going to give us 7 or 9 minutes responding. And then I'm going to be coming out, and then Frank can respond to them. Then I'll come out to the audience and we'll take clubs of questions, typically Academy of Ideas, Battle of Ideas style. But I suppose the thing I wanted to say to you is that just be frank and open-minded, and we all probably need a little bit of humility to try and understand what's going on. But this is first of what I hope will be a series of discussions on this. When I say I hope, I was doing talk radio this morning, and the person I was, the person on Mike Graham said to me, well, I hear this peace talks, it might be all over at the weekend. And I thought, no, it's not like that, Mike. As much as I would like that to be the case, I think this is something that's going to be having an impact on us for some time to come in whatever form. And so therefore we will be using tonight to launch those kind of discussions. So can we give a warm welcome to all our speakers in particular?
Yeah, just echoing what Claire was saying, that it's quite important that we keep our minds open and not come to any hasty conclusions. From my own experience, a lot of my friends, a lot of people that I know who overnight became COVID experts and suddenly mutated into becoming Ukrainian experts. And it happens almost magically that they know everything there is to know about these particular kind of events. And I think in particular, what's happening now, there's so much propaganda on all sides that whenever I see the screen and I see Russian tanks being blown up, or whenever I see Russia talking about Nazis in the Ukraine, I almost instinctively become skeptical and do not necessarily believe everything that I see. But nevertheless, there are a number of things that we can take for granted as being critically important. And there are certain moral issues at stake here, on which we should take a stand from this point onwards, because the issues at stake are really, really formidable. What I really want to talk about is what I wrote about the last couple of days, is the phenomenon of historical amnesia and the impact that historical amnesia has had on the outlook of people that are in our governments in the West, but also who run the governments on the other side in the East. An inability to understand that history has not returned. History is not like a person that's like Rip Van Winkle, gone to sleep, and then kind of wakes up. History has been here all the time. It's just that a lot of people refuse to recognize the continuity that existed with what's been going on for hundreds of years, particularly since the 19th century, but particularly since Second World War. As I was coming down to London from Kent, the import of historical amnesia was really brought home to me by a commentary written in The Guardian by Robert Reich. He used to be Bill Clinton's Secretary of Labor. He's quite a well-known American commentator, has written many, many books. He's regarded as a bit of a guru on the global economy. And he basically to me, personifies what I take to be the principal cultural disease of our time, which is, as I said, historical amnesia. So basically what Reich did was to say, I've been wrong all along, which is refreshing. It's always good when a serious commentator acknowledges that they got it wrong. So I've been wrong all along because he thought that history came to an end, nationalism had disappeared, or was more or less something that existed on the margins of the Western world. He believed that borders had become irrelevant. We live in a post-border kind of society. He believed that democracy was inevitable, and he also believed that nuclear wars could never ever happen again. Okay, the guy is foolish, not surprising given the fact that he was Clinton's Secretary of Labor. But nevertheless, his historical amnesia, his belief that we live in a post-nation, a post-border kind of a world where everything is globalized and that is really all that matters, is a kind of outlook that dominated thinking on geopolitics, on international relations for some times. And I think that what's interesting about Reich and his co-thinkers in Britain and America, in general the Western elites, is that they failed to grasp that at the moment when they realize they've been wrong, it's not that they are finally catching up with present-day reality, but rather that they're very, very slowly catching up with the past. They're very, very slowly getting back to where they should have been a long time ago. For a long time now, especially amongst the cultural milieus within sort of Western societies, there was this kind of act of self-deception which continually emphasized the newness of our era. We live in a new era. The number of times you hear that kind of rhetorical accomplishment, a new era, end of history. It's a global, postmodern world, a globalized world that is nothing like what existed in the past. We live in a social media era where information is now so transparent and clear that we finally kind of get to know everything. Right? There was that kind of fantasy that was extremely powerful. And I think what the tragic events in the Ukraine demonstrate to us is that history cannot be unmade. It's not something that you could just casually leave behind. We have to come to terms from this point onwards with its inescapable truths. When I wrote my study, First World War, Still No End in Sight, it seemed to me that the Western world had embarked on a long march from its past. Throughout the last 12 decades, it has restlessly sought to detach itself from its historical legacy and values and the moral outlook that was associated with it. And I think what we've seen, and becomes very, very clear today, is that in all but words, the West has morally disarmed itself in that period, became morally estranged from just about everything that made Western culture, Western civilization, in a sense, what it is. And the implications of this development, and the implications are devastating, could be totally ignored during the decades of the Cold War. Because during the decades of the Cold War, the West could parasitically live off its moral authority that it had in relation to the Soviet Union. In other words, as long as the Soviet Union was there, as long as the Soviet bloc was there, the West could look good. We're the free world. We are a democratic bloc, not like these dictatorships on the other side of the divide. And in that context, during those decades, it didn't have to do very much. The West didn't have to do very much to maintain its moral authority and to legitimate itself. It didn't really have to think about the big issues of our time. Now, since the Cold War ended, the ability to maintain this stance is not possible. It's gradually unraveling and has unraveled over that time. And in particular, the reason why this is important is because when you become detached from the past, when you lose sight of legacy that nourish the outlook, that sort of the foundation for making sense of the world, what also happens is you lose your geopolitical sensibility, your capacity to understand geopolitical issues, particularly the capacity to understand your national interest and the national interest of others becomes considerably diminished. And you can see this very, very clearly in the last 20 or 30 years, when you had all this attempt to talk about this fantasy of a new international order, a global order where nations and national conflicts could be somehow regulated through certain forms of rules and international bodies. And yet a situation where very, very often the Foreign Office here in Britain or the State Department in the United States really began to come across like a bunch of social workers, continually going on about humanitarianism and continually going on about their newly kind of found values. And whenever anybody opened their mouth and said, we should really be thinking about our national interest, that was somehow denounced as being selfish that was somehow seen as being bad, somehow a prelude to becoming an invasive dynamic force. So that sensibility was very, very important. And it's at this point in time that as geopolitics diminishes as a kind of art, which is really important for any ruling elite in any kind of society, it's at this point in time that for America, for example, embarks on the road of becoming the world's regime changer. And every regime it finds, it's kind of morally denounced as being inferior because it hasn't got the same high standards of democracy as you have in Idaho or in Texas. And decides that hey, it's high time that Colonel Gaddafi went, and they were replaced by American educated Democrats with the predictable results. Similar things happened in Iraq and in Syria and in a number of other places. And I think that kind of attitude indicated some very big problems. One of the consequences of this was that the West became, to some extent, unable to understand Russia's security anxieties and never really understood that just because there was a regime change in Russia and just because Gorbachev handed power to Yeltsin and Yeltsin eventually to Putin, that things were far more fragile and far more unstable than it seemed out to the outside world. And in particular, it never had that kind of strategic empathy which you need to a defeated power, especially a regional superpower, which what Russia is. And then in order to kind of alleviate any of those anxieties that they might have had. It never actually understood this problem because it had lost the capacity to think geopolitically. One of the things that happened as this occurred, which I think is particularly relevant for the British context, but it's also relevant throughout Europe, is that as we lost sight of history, as we thought that it was there in the past, it no longer made very much of sense. The values of the past were also seen as being discredited. And I'm not just talking about values to do with sexuality or all the kind of issues that are continually debated in the culture wars. I think there are other kind of basic values. They might sound really old-fashioned now. And whenever I talk to them about my students, they often smirk and think that Freud is this old schmuck who, believes in the value of duty. But whenever I mention the word duty, huge laughter. This is something that's no longer relevant. When I mention values like responsibility or service, loyalty, right? Loyalty in a world where every young kid that I meet is already has got a job, is already thinking of their next job because there's no such thing as a job for life. And their commitment is the CV that shows just how fast they went from one job to another. And that kind of promiscuous sense of instability, lack of commitment, which I actually celebrated, is really quite important. And finally, patriotism. I mean, when I talk to teachers about the importance of patriotism, they are embarrassed. They think this is not a subject that's fit for a classroom. How can you promote patriotism, a commitment to the community that you belong to? So if you have all these values being trashed, and in particular trashed by the people on top, not by ordinary people, but by people on top who are the most vociferous opponents of these kinds of values, then it's not surprising that another value, which is even more regarded as outlandishly bad, and which is the value of what I think is still really quite important, that of the warrior ethos. That actually men, for that matter women, should be, in a sense, ready to fight. And not only be ready to fight, but see the need to fight to defend their communities as part and parcel of their responsibility. That ethos, sort of is seen today as being far too masculine. It's far too heteronormative. It's got all kinds of negative kind of qualities that are attached to it, which is not what civilized, educated people do. The warrior ethos is seen as being met. Of course, you can see the result of that when you look at the British Army, where within the British Army, the kind of lectures they're now getting at Sandhurst remind me of the empty-headed sociological lectures given by my colleagues in sociology departments throughout the higher education system in the United Kingdom, where they basically told that essentially they have to bear arms because you're in the army, but your job is to be a sensitive social worker, rather than anything else. And you will probably have read last week about the big discussions in the army about the need for there to be a introducing vegan uniforms, because at least a minority of the military forces believe that leather and other kind of products that are not animal friendly is not the way forward. I mean, just think about that. While people are fighting for their lives in the Ukraine, soldiers here in Britain are being encouraged to think about such silly kind of issues. But that is, in a sense, an extreme example, but it's an example that captures this kind of confusion and disorientation of what an army should look like, what a foreign policy should look like, what national interest should look like. And I think that's the context for what's happened in the Ukraine, because at a certain point, Putin decided that given the fact that that his security needs haven't been met, but at the same time, the West has indicated that he wasn't going to fight. When Biden more or less said there is no such thing as a red line, as far as we're concerned, he basically gave, in a sense, Putin a free pass. Basically indicated that there is no risk, no real serious risk to enter into Ukraine, because all that you're going to face is economic sanctions. And you don't need a PhD in military history to know that economic sanctions do not stop tanks, and they do not prevent airplanes from dropping bombs on your people, or prevent missiles from hitting your own towns.
British missiles, Operation Orbital was British missiles.
Yeah, good for you. I mean, we all know that these are British missiles, but there's an old story that goes back to Renaissance, which is you get other people fight for you. The Russians do this using Chechens, and other kind of mercenaries, and we're doing the same thing. We're very happy for other people to fight. Brave Ukrainians, are really good at fighting, and we'll watch them on TV, and we'll make collections for them, and we'll do all that kind of stuff. We'll be the voyeurs, while somewhere else the action is kind of gradually sort of unfolding. And it seems to me that we have no choice but to defend Ukraine. And we have to defend Ukraine not just rhetorically, and we have to defend Ukraine not just simply by providing them material support. I mean, all those things are really quite important. I do think that at some point in time, we have to recognize that Ukraine isn't just a country that's just been invaded, isn't just a country that's facing a mass army that's not going to stop anytime soon. Ukraine is the only country in that part of the world which is large enough and substantial enough and has got the military capability to actually at least slow down the invasion from Russia. It is the classic buffer zone between Russia and everything else to the west of that. If Ukraine is occupied, then the security of every country in the Baltic, the security of Poland and other Eastern European countries are all going to be put at risk. And it's going to be put at risk not just simply because Russia necessarily wants to invade those countries, but because, and this is where the real danger lies, Russia is so unstable internally that anything can happen when things blow up. You already saw what happened in Kazakhstan. You already saw what happened in Belarus. You already see that Russia is a disaster area waiting to happen. So it's quite important to realize this. And it seems to me that under those circumstances, we do need to think about lending Ukraine far greater military support than merely providing them with kind of anti-tank guns and various missiles that they have received. Myself, after thinking about this for some time, I've come to the conclusion that we can no longer say in black and white terms that we're not going to have, we're not going to try to seek to establish a no-fly zone. Because if you do that, what we're saying is that the threat of a nuclear retaliation by Russia, that threat will paralyze us from doing anything effective. And obviously, we need to be very careful and we need to think about this. And I'm not arguing that we should just simply and mindlessly get stuck in. But I was horrified when the Americans prevented the Polish people from sending Americans to Ukraine. That could have been the first step towards maintaining and defending the sovereign airspace of the Ukraine. I also think that it's a legitimate aspiration to perhaps set up a limited no-fly zone that protects the humanitarian corridors. So basically what we're saying is that that area, or the humanitarian area, should also be kind of protected. But in any case, the point I'm trying to make is, I'm not a military tactician, and I know there are people who know far more than I do about this. But the one thing I do think is that we need to have a form of deterrence that is far more robust than the one we have at the moment. Because unless we have a more robust form of deterrence, then in a sense we become hostages for the fear of a nuclear attack by Russia. And once people know that throughout the world, then it's only a matter of time before China goes into Taiwan, and it's only a matter of time before other predatory forces feel uninhibited about moving on and doing bad things to other parts of the world. Our job, I think, at the moment is to, in a sense, support Ukraine in whatever form we can possibly can. But we also have another job, which here domestically, in Britain and America, we have to remind our elites of their responsibility to be leaders rather than just merely sort of passive voyeurs of what's really happening. We have to have an intellectual and a moral revolution in our country where we are reminded of the fact that rather than allowing this process of moral disarmament to continue, we have to rearm ourselves morally in the first instance. That's the prelude to being effective in any decision that we might take in the future. And that's something that all of you in this room can participate in. You don't need to be a soldier. You don't need to be rich. We all have the capacity for moral reasoning and for taking our legacy and our past sufficiently seriously to take a stand against evil. Thank you.
There's a lot to unpack there, John, but just your kind of initial thoughts, either on what I said, but what you've been thinking about as well for the last few days. Just give us a bit.
Yeah, thanks. So, yeah, well, that's the first time I'm hearing a lot of that stuff from Frank. Yeah, there is a lot to unpack there. I mean, I do agree with Frank's first point that, I mean, I often find myself thinking this, that we do live in this kind of tabula rasa sort of society, which we're always in the present. The past is this black hole. And I think it's important to discuss, how we've got here and why that is. I think the key point is that a society which has lost its belief in its capacity to progress in the future, a society that has lost touch with the sorts of values that Frank was talking about, and with tradition, and a society which ultimately believes that the problems are insoluble. Society actually that's given up on human agency actually ceases to concern itself with the past, and that's where we are now. So I think history is very important, and we need to, if we want to understand what's happening right now in Eastern Europe and Ukraine, what Russia is doing and what its motivations are and how it's likely to respond, we really do need to understand how we got here. So that's just a first reaction to Frank's point. The first point that I want to make is that I agree absolutely with Frank that Russia's war in Ukraine is an abomination. A national leader who feels that they have been forced into a corner, as Vladimir Putin obviously feels that he has as a result of NATO Western diplomacy over the past 30 years, still has choices. And the choice that Putin has made is an immoral and indefensible one. And in fact, Russia lost the moral high ground insofar as it had any when it annexed, on the principle of national sovereignty, Tim, it lost that in 2014 when it annexed Crimea and abandoned the principle of non-intervention and national sovereignty, which previously it had insisted upon in response to the NATO bombing of Serbia and Montenegro over Kosovo in 1999, which was, I guess, for Russia as well, its moment of greatest humiliation, an unprovoked war of aggression by NATO against a sovereign country without any UN authorization. So Russia surrendered any kind of moral authority on that point when it went into Ukraine already in 2014. And that is not to let NATO off the hook. By any measure, this catastrophe in Ukraine does represent a massive failure of Western diplomacy over many decades. We probably I haven't got probably time now to talk about how we got here. And I think if we look at how we did get here, we can look at proximate causes, near-term causes, such as which were underestimated probably on the Western side, the breakdown of the Minsk process, which the Russians were very aggrieved about, came to believe that France and Germany were basically taking Ukraine's side and not putting pressure on them to implement key parts of that. Obviously, the Minsk agreement is completely unacceptable to any government in Ukraine and would be the end of any government which accepted that, basically through the constitution, allowing some measure of, quite a large measure of autonomy and self-rule for Donetsk and Luhansk, a sort of Trojan horse. That was always the aim of Russia, a Trojan horse in Ukraine that would mean that Ukraine would never be fully in control of its destiny and would be divided, and Russia would have a say in its future. But that was one thing. But it was more than Minsk in what happened last year in 2021. Obviously, Russia increasingly feeling that NATO was encroaching right up to its border. Ukraine became the biggest recipient of US military aid in the world, more or less in 2021. NATO was conducting all sorts of exercises, military exercises, carrying nuclear weapons right up to Russia's border. So a lot of things were going on. The reactivation of this base in Mainz-Kastel in Germany, which really alarmed the Russians, this hypersonic Dark Eagle missile. So there's a lot of things happening in the near term. But obviously the issues go much deeper than that. And obviously the biggest issue for Russia for very many years was the question of NATO enlargement and the sighting of NATO missile defense systems in new NATO member states in Poland and Romania and so on. And, this has been the constant kind of refrain and list of grievances and resentment that we've heard now for decades coming from Putin, that this was a betrayal, that promises that were made, and they were made, though they never entered into any legal treaty or agreement, that this wouldn't happen, and that NATO would not enlarge into Russia sees as its backyard, that they would not cite missile defense systems there. Well, obviously it all happened in successive waves, with the most latest round of enlargement happening in 2021 when North Macedonia joined. So that was the that's the kind of background. There were many, many other issues as well. Breakdown of talks on nuclear treaties and disarmament. I mentioned the Kosovo thing. So that's how we got here. And I think probably in the discussion we want to talk about a bit more about what it means. I do think, what we're heading towards is a new division of Europe, with a line drawn further in the east, regardless of what the outcome of this war is, and even if Russia is pushed back to the east and suffers major reversals, it's certainly not going to be welcomed back into the international system and the Western club anytime soon. I think that this is certainly going to drive Russia into the arms of China. I think there's a real underestimation of how far that strategic partnership has gone. It's not just something that's happened overnight. Russia pivoted east already in 2012, had probably drawn the conclusion at that stage that there was nothing for it in terms of security, any kind of security guarantees in Europe, and probably also not much economic future either. So that's certainly going to happen. I think the US, in terms of its pivot to Asia, is going to have its hands full in Europe. And so the whole idea of containment of China and building this counterbalancing alliance is going to be delayed to some extent. There's many, many other consequences. I think the balance of power in Europe is going to shift. We've seen what's been happening in Germany recently. We'll see whether Germany feels that it's able to play a more central role in determining the security and defense issues in Europe. And if it does so, that will begin to shift the balance of forces within Europe. I think for Europe, this is a massive wake-up call. And when I was in Bulgaria just before the war broke out, I was listening to a lot of European politicians. They were all saying the same thing. This was when the build-up was going on and the talks were taking place. What they were all saying was, how can we allow Russia and the US to determine what happens on our continent? So this whole idea of sovereignty for Europe and autonomy is going to obviously come into its own more. There's quite a lot of other things. The arms race is going to take off in a very serious way now, but maybe we can come back to those in the discussion. On the no-fly zone, I do disagree with Frank, but maybe we can come back to that, and maybe there's other better ways. The first thing, if you want a no-fly zone, the first thing you have to do is go to Russia and destroy their bases in Russia before you can even start to do anything. So it's maybe not the best way forward.
Yes, Frank and I have had a slight disagreement on the no-fly zone question, but actually that was really, really helpful, Joan, and there's loads of things to come back on, and we will do, but for now, just your thoughts, Tim.
Do you mind if I go up there?
Are we going to stand at the...
Oh, is there no mic?
There's no microphone.
There's no mic.
I'll stay there.
Okay, sorry.
That's all right. Can you all hear me through this? Yes. First of all, sorry, Joan. At one point, I wasn't scoffing something you said. I was coughing. I ate flapjack this morning, and I think part of it is stuck in my throat. I keep coughing. Just to pick up, first of all, on a couple of things that Frank said. First of all, I like the point about how expertise has switched from virology to war. But I think it's more than that. I think there's been a transference of psychology. I think I have felt mobilized in the last 2.5 years, and I feel mobilized again. It's not necessarily a bad thing, by the way. I'm just saying I think that a population which has been encouraged to be worried, it's very easy for that population to then transfer those fears and that mobilization to a different kind of threat. Secondly, on the point about history didn't stop, this is so true. And the West is so incredibly lucky, and that luck breeds a certain decadence and myopia. Of course, even in the 1990s, which we remember largely for Bill Clinton's sex life and sitcom Friends, the rest of the world had Rwanda to deal with, it had Serbia to deal with, it had nationalism, and of course the emergence of religious fundamentalism, which the West simply didn't treat seriously enough until 9/11. And even today, there is still, as I say, this myopia in the West's approach towards the rest of the world that not only gets the outside world wrong, but doesn't notice our own involvement in it. Today, I saw MPs discussing the 81 executions which have occurred in Saudi Arabia, which is horrific, don't get me wrong. It's appalling. I hope Britain does more than just have a strong word with its friend. But of course, the West carries their own strengths. There's no judicial procedure in those, I can assure you. And we have killed innocents in the course of doing that. The West also executes people. And then finally, on the question of values, duty, patriotism, I'm going to come back to that at the end. I will simply signpost at this point that I personally feel strong attachment to those values. In part, I have sort of bought into them by becoming a Catholic. But I also feel some ambivalence about them. And actually, I think the more seriously you take those values, the more right it is to be questioning of them and to feel, as I say, some degree of ambivalence. With regards to what's happened with Russia and Ukraine, one thing I want to say from the outset, for the avoidance of all doubt, is that Vladimir Putin is wicked and his invasion of Ukraine is evil. I'm saying that because I want to be able to speak freely, and I may sometimes say things which are not popular at the moment, but I want to make it absolutely clear where I do stand. There are some of my friends on the traditionalist right who do not feel the same way, and I have been surprised and on some occasions disappointed by that. Tucker Carlson is an example. Tucker Carlson does not endorse the invasion, of course, but feels the West should have nothing to do with it. And you can always tell when Tucker has intellectually overreached because he starts to laugh like Mickey Mouse. Just watch his programs and start to go, aha, aha. That's what he does, very strange. It's also important to stress that what we see happening in Russia is not necessarily Russianness. I don't think we should accept that. We are seeing a singular will play out, a dictator who is at present enjoying the run of being able to define what Russia is and what its strategic interests are, but really it's an articulation of Vladimir Putin's interests and his own personal take on Russian history. Let's not confuse the dictatorship with Russia itself. There have been many different Putins, from the Putin of the Soviet era, to the Putin of the business oligarch era of the 90s, to the populist Putin of the 2000s, and now this new nationalist Putin who has decided he is going to revive ancient Rus, that Ukraine does not exist, etc., etc. So this Putin is himself a phantasm. And he is most definitely not Russia, which is not only a wonderful civilization and culture, but also a culture which, if you know it, you will appreciate has a long tradition of dissent and opposition to the state. And it's, again, critical not to assume there's the tendency in Western coverage of all Asiatic politics to assume that it is a land of followers, that it is a land of people who naturally are collectivists, naturally just obey the leader and the boss and follow along. That's not true. And I would add as well that I personally strongly dislike seeing footage of Russian soldiers being paraded across TikTok, because those young men are victims as well. Most of them are conscripts. The Russian army is awful, and it seems, if Western intelligence is correct, that they were lied to about the invasion, so they don't even necessarily know what they're doing there. So let's please stop seeing their faces, because it's not fair. It's not fair. One of the reasons why this has happened, why this has been allowed to happen, is because the West lives in a sort of fantastical bubble. It lies about itself, and it lies about the outside world. And at the heart of this fantasy is the West's conviction, or the conviction of much of the West, in the Enlightenment project, or at least a mutated, deformed version of the Enlightenment project, which has been pushed to a very strange sort of postmodernist extreme. And I don't have time to acknowledge all the nuances and the caveats, but in essence, it is the idea that man is born with various cultural inheritances that hold him back and which twist his nature. And that if only you could strip those things away and get back to the real natural man, therein lies progress, which will end at democracy and freedom and the end of poverty and sickness. Now, in the course of telling the story about itself, the West, as I say, tells lies about itself. It tells itself that it has conquered religion and nationalism. It hasn't at all. If an alien came down and studied Western society, it would listen to Greta Thunberg and assume she was the new Messiah. We do religion. We've just transferred that religion away from the church and towards other things instead. We are still a very religious people. And as for nationalism, I think we still do nationalism as well. We just articulate it in a slightly different way, whether it be voting for Brexit, which was in part about a reassertion of national sovereignty, or indeed the kind of European nationalism which I sense emerging from this crisis, a new sense of European identity. Why is it that the West has been so exercised about Ukraine? It's because it's on Europe's doorstep. There's no escaping that. There's not a value judgment to say that. In fact, it upsets me to think that we were not quite as concerned about Yemenis and Syrians. I think that's tragic. But there's no escaping. There is a sort of European national identity which is emerging from this crisis. So we tell these stories about ourselves, but worse than that, we transfer them to the rest of the world. And we assume that what the rest of the world wants is what we want. A quick example of this is if you look at the work of Jonathan Haidt, he points out that Europeans have an assumption that everybody the world over wants the same thing, which is personal freedom, and that everyone the world over regards culture as relative. So that people in the West, kids in the West, when interviewed, will say things like, well, my family believes X, but I don't expect everyone else to believe it. And the Westerners have assumed that this is how the entire world thinks. And Haidt points out that if you actually go and talk to Indians and Pakistanis, he provides data to show this, you'll find they don't think that. They think that their cultural values are universal, or ought to be. That it ought not to be right to eat a cow, or that it ought not to be right to be seen naked. And when you look at that, you realize that actually our assumption that we are value-free or that values are mutable is itself a value, is itself an expression of Western identity. So we transfer our own sense of Westerners onto the Russians and we look at them and we think, what do they really want? They're saying all this stuff about Ukraine and ancient Russia, but what do they really want? They want a democracy and they want to be rich. And that's the way we proceeded in dealing with them for the last 30 years. And the reality is that's not necessarily what they want, or at least not what its leadership wants. And therefore we've been having a false argument. Vladimir Putin signaled his view of the world last year in an essay in which he explained precisely what he thought of Ukraine and what he intended to do with it. And people, including myself, did not take the essay seriously because it seemed so batshit crazy. And we thought that's not a very Western way of thinking. It must be propaganda. It must be he must be making it up. It must be a pretext to something else that he wants that we can give him. And then it turns out that actually, no, all along, he does think large parts of Ukraine are Russia, and he is determined to reunite them. And unlike us, one thing that does tend to unite the Asiatic countries is they tend to think and to plan in decades, whereas we think and plan in terms of electoral cycles. And therefore, they stay one step ahead of us. Nationalism is a reality, and religion is a reality. It's happened in the case of Ukraine. Russia has or Putin has a nationalist vision. He's trying to reunite. And equally, the Ukrainians have a nationalist vision too. In fact, ironically, Russian aggression may well be the thing that creates a coherent Ukrainian nation, the invader coming from outside. Because prior to that, it was a very divided, very corrupt country. But once you are attacked, you gain a sense of yourself. And it's interesting also that parts of the country which were sort of nicked or occupied in 2014 by the Russians or the Russian separatists have turned out to be some of the strongest resistors of Russian aggression this time around. People who a decade ago might have been sympathetic to Moscow, having actually experienced Russian fascism, now are very, very critical. So there is this reality of nationalism and religion, and that I think is what we've been reminded of in the last year. And as if looking in a mirror darkly, we see it reflected back upon ourselves. The warrior ethos is still there. I don't know if Frank was saying it's gone or not, but it is still there. It is still there. And it erupts in the irony of people who on Twitter a year ago wouldn't leave their house for fear of dying from the virus, now saying that they are ready to fight. They are ready to fight. Well, in that case, as I said at the beginning, I am ambivalent about those values, because whilst the warrior is indeed a virtuous thing, I loathe war. And if this does snowball into something large and dramatic, it may seem counterintuitive, but some of the bravest people will be the people saying stop. Thank you.
You can't answer all that because we haven't got time. couple of points you want to pick up, Frank?
Yeah, I mean, two very interesting points that were made. A number of things I disagree with. I'm not going to go into a lot of them, except that the way that I see history is a little bit different than perhaps Tim has kind of looked at it, because it seems to me that history doesn't mean, it's not about saying that things have always, that were there in the past are now here in the present and have the same kind of meaning as they would have had previously. So, for example, I think that one of the interesting things about what's going on is that, contrary to appearances, nationalism is actually very feeble at the moment. And you can see that even within Russia itself, where although probably the majority of Russians support Putin's war for a variety of reasons, the actual enthusiasm for getting stuck in and fighting and it is not very sort of strong. And you have a lot of reports, for example, from Russia of essentially forcing people to join the army, and the very fact that they're using wrong recruits to fight a lot of the battles indicates that there is a kind of pressure from above rather than enthusiasm from below. This is not like the French Revolution, when people went out and joined, and their enthusiasm carried the revolution to large parts of Europe. There isn't that kind of, and that's the case, I think, everywhere. I think that what you have in Germany or in Britain or in France is a conspicuously small number of people who really think that fighting is really what it's all about, or want to go and fight. Most people are really switched off from this. So it's in this context that I talk about the war ethos, not because I want to celebrate it or think that it's something that is superior to other kind of ethoses, but the nation is somehow devoid of that. And if we live in a country like England or Britain, where in many places in the southeast where there are large army barracks, the soldiers are told not to walk around in their uniforms because they will get beaten up, or people will make fun of them. Then what you have is almost the opposite of what a warrior ethos is. I haven't got a name for that, but it does indicate a certain kind of problem that we're confronted with. And it seems to me it's important to realize, just one final word. Whatever we think about Russia, I think it's wrong to personalize it on Putin to the extent that we're doing, that this is Putin's war, that he's this mad or single-minded individual. There's different interpretations of him being almost single-handedly responsible for what is going on. I don't want to, in any sense, minimize his role in this, but we have a Russian society that is inherently fragile and weak, that is in a very strong defensive mode at the moment. But there's a certain kind of impulse towards the kind of behavior that we've seen. And if it was just simply Putin, then the problem would end. But as you know, if Putin was replaced by a general or somebody else, I'm afraid that at this particular moment in time, you would have somebody in charge with a very similar orientation towards the outside world. Just one small point on John's point on China and Russia. I slightly disagree with Jones. I think that the contradictions between China and Russia are quite formidable. And Russia doesn't want to be a second junior partner in this. And China is actually worried about Russian irrational behavior. And they're worried about what's going to happen should Russia fragment further and create instability towards the Asian republics. So I think there's a lot of tension and potential conflict there, which will mean that the rapprochement that exists between these two countries, I don't think could last for very much longer.
Okay, so listen, there's nothing more serious, I suppose, in politics than war and peace. And I think that when we talk about these things, it's very important to be able to debate them in the spirit of unfettered freedom, right? And especially when you're trying to get grips with things that are so difficult, and when there are tendencies all around to close down debates, as we know, from all sides, by the way. So that's the first thing. I would say that this is quite a challenging period, and it's certainly discombobulating people. So a few discombobulations to throw at you that you can kind of come back on. So here I am, a lefty anti-militarist, right? And I have anti-interventionist, critic of NATO over many years. But it has been extraordinary to find that when the West says, well, what can we do? Well, we can't do anything, that it reminds me of there is no alternative, we just have to put up with it. So it's basically, well, of course, it's terrible that they've invaded Ukraine, but what can you do? Do you know what I mean? So we can't really do much because otherwise it will lead to World War III. And you think you're meant to be the West. You're meant to be NATO. For God's sake, where's that military spirit? I mean, it just feels too open-ended. So there's a tension there that I can't reconcile, which people might want to consider. The other thing is that a lot of people I know we effectively are very critical of the West at the moment. It's kind of like, in the UK, it just takes the form of anything any British politician does or says. You can't believe them. They're all liars. They're all incompetent. And it seems a little bit of that kind of Western self-loathing that some people are familiar with. But somebody said something interesting to me over the weekend. They said, and this is a kind of particular, last 2 years thing. Over the last 2 years with COVID, the government and the mainstream media broke the social contract through the lockdown policies and civil liberties. And for a lot of people, that was a kind of radicalizing moment. And prior to that, there was a lot of people who voted Leave, who also felt that they got a shock. There they were wandering around being voters, and then they felt they were completely sold out. They therefore have, at the moment, there's a lot of people who just say, I don't believe anything that's coming out of the government's mouths, don't believe anything I see on the telly. And there's quite a nihilistic cynicism that's developed, which is a peculiar atmosphere to operate in. So I say those things because what I'm saying is it's quite complicated and layered. And also all of our speakers, and particularly Frank's essay, throw up lots of issues. I'm not asking you to say any of them, but feel free to make your case civilly, listen, and also be prepared to potentially change your mind, because that's the whole point of this. Okay, so thank you. So you had your hand up first. We'll start there, and then I'll come there. Yeah. Sorry. Sorry. There's a micro. Yeah, because we're live streaming. It's a bit of an experiment on live streaming because it's a bit DIY, but it's working. So speak in the mic. And Emma and Flora are on the microphones. I'll kind of come to you. Yeah.
Okay, well, I'm grateful to Frank for those last comments about this is not just about Putin. And I think, Tim, considering you did a good job at presenting the problems of the West and Western wishful thinking, I think there's an element of wishful thinking in imagining this is Putin's war. That doesn't mean that there's loads of Russians in support, but for every conscript and potential saboteur, there's also a Z meme activist. There's quite a lot of contradictions going on over there, and I do think we need to be careful. We all know, I believe, that the assassination of Archduke Ferdinand did not, on its own, was not the cause of the First World War, which would have happened probably irrespective. And in that regard, I just wanted to tease out from the speakers to what extent they think that irrespective of this war, there's a geopolitical shift due. And it could be this, you could put a bullet in Putin's head, it may go in abeyance for 5 years, but the tension's still there, it remains unresolved.
Okay, so I'm taking a few hands. Just the person. No, okay, it's gone. Right. So, and then no, then you afterwards. Yeah. Wait for the mic. Sorry. I know it's a bit of a. That's my fault. I'm sorry. I try and look at me, all of the audience, all of the time, as to where I'm pointing on the microphone question. Yeah, go on.
Thanks, Frank, for that introduction, for getting us thinking, because that's one thing we really need to do at this moment in time is think carefully about what we're proposing. My question to you really is, if the elite is decadent, as you say, why beg them? I mean, why wait for them? Why beg them to do something? Why don't we ourselves take action and shape the future and create history in a human form? I think my values probably
differ from yours in terms of what I would advocate. I'd be for democracy, people power and international solidarity action. We don't have to be passive as a public in this historical moment.
Thank you. And that lady there.
Thank you to the panel. What role do you think the European Union has played in the course of events? It seems to me it's kind of one empire, the European Union, against another former empire, the Soviet Union. So I appreciate your thoughts on that. Thank you.
Thank you. Right, so somebody's got the microphone there, and if you can just pass it to the woman in black behind you. Yes. Yeah.
Yeah, so for me, the phrase behind Tim's head on the banner has never been more relevant. The Battle of Ideas, also a great festival. Get your tickets on the Battle of Ideas website. Has never been more relevant. It seems like we're having a battle of ideas across the West, perhaps within Russia as well, but then also the forces of West versus East. In a way which certainly hasn't happened to this extent in my lifetime, being slightly still able to call myself a young man. But yeah, so this feels like the first massive escalation into violence on this scale close to home that I've experienced. Where does this go? Like, obviously, all the projections of doom and gloom at the moment are about prospective World War III. But how do we bridge these gaps both at home and internationally without things just escalating worse and worse and worse?
Right, thank you very much. Now, this is what's going to happen. I'm going to take you, I'm going to take you two. I haven't not seen you. I'm going to come back to the panel, and then I'm going to come back out, right? And then I'm going to start with, with that gentleman there. No, carry on. Yeah, go on. Yeah.
My question goes on from the question that was raised over here, really, which is what does international solidarity look like today? And when you're advocating a no-fly zone and the British government, presumably, and other Western governments making that happen, are you suggesting that that is a sign of that is international solidarity? I'm not really sure about that. And then the other question is, no one's painted a particularly positive picture, and I haven't seen a positive picture really, of opposition in Russia, because international solidarity might imply supporting people in Russia who are challenging the war, for example. And is there anything to show our solidarity with in Russia? And then just finally, my daughter said to me the other day, I've just seen someone in their cellar in the Ukraine talking to me, telling me what this war in Ukraine, what it means to her. She says, I'm 17, she's 17, she's talking to me now. Isn't that amazing? You would never have had that before. And she was expressing amazement that she could talk to this girl in Ukraine whose house has been bombed. And obviously, it seems to me there's a lot of censorship taking place in the British media and the Russian media, but there is this opportunity, or there's something going on where people, 17-year-old girls in London can talk to a 17-year-old girl in the Ukraine.
Just on the solidarity point, just because it means I can make that point now, which is on your seats. We put this Blackburn and Darwin with Ukraine. This is a speaker from the Battle of Ideas and a friend of the Academy of Ideas, Rick Moore, who's basically taken a van over on Friday and is trying to raise some support. And I'm not just, so and we're going to have a collection at the end, right? And if anyone wants to give anything, or just use the Just Giving site. But it's just really to advertise, because it's actually, a lot of people have wanted to do something, and I wanted to see what the panel thinks, but anyone out there as well, which is, having been demobilised under the lockdown circumstances, war against a virus was stay at home, do nothing. And this is a kind of real war, and now actually people are saying, I'm going to do this. So many man with vans, as it were, going over to Ukraine. But actually it's sort of quite inspiring, and also that's partly you know, people saying, I'll have somebody stay with me and all that, you know, before Michael Gove turned it into a bureaucratic nightmare, that kind of come and stay instinct was one of generosity. But is that all, you know, people have said to me, oh, this is just sentimental nonsense, Claire, you know, what are you talking about? Why are you encouraging it? I'm actually very supportive of Rick Moore and the Van Gang and those people who do it, but is that just nonsense? And what do people think about that? I'd be interested. Right, that gentleman there.
Yes, Claire, sorry. Yes. Claire, I was amused by your point about, well, amused and I'm a bit disappointed around that whole point. The last 2 years we've been fighting all the COVID regulatory nonsense, in my opinion. I stopped watching the BBC, I stopped watching Sky, mainstream media, and now, oh, well, it's a war, but it's probably not real because COVID was being pursued in a propagandistic way. I think that's a mistake. I think we need to have a dexterity of mind to embrace what is clearly nonsense and understand it for that, and then to actually acknowledge what is clearly happening and is very real. And I think it's very dangerous for some of the people that certainly I have worked with over the last 2 years on the COVID issue, who now say, well, this is just a continuation of that propaganda. I think that's very, very dangerous. But my point and my question to put to the panel and my concern is around this issue of, well, NATO has encroached on Russia. And this is therefore, it's explainable why Russia would seek to want to invade Ukraine and do what it is doing. Not excuse it, but there is a rationale to it. But on the other side, what are we saying? I read Lionel Barber in Spectator today saying, well, we've got to give we've got to guarantee that Ukraine will be neutral. Who the hell gives the West the right to tell Ukraine what it should or shouldn't be doing? That, to me, seems wrong. If Ukraine, as a democratic nation state, a sovereign country, wants to join NATO, we should let them join NATO. If they want to join the EU, we should let them join the EU. And I'm very concerned that there is this, as Frank was making the point, this timidity. That things are explainable, and I'd be interested in views on that. Thank you.
And the person there, yeah.
Well, all this talk about the warrior ethos puts me in mind of a discussion 30 years ago in relation to the former Yugoslavia. Many liberal intellectuals bemoaned the weakness, the moral confusion, the risk aversion of the West, and wondered why it wasn't intervening more forcefully and robustly in the former Yugoslavia. One of them even wrote a book called The Warrior's Honor, Michael Ignatieff. He wasn't alone. David Reef, Mary Caldor, there was quite a lot of them. It struck me as quite a repulsive thing to do. It struck me as kind of parasitic on somebody else's war to try and work out your own moral clarity at home through piggybacking on someone else's fighting and suffering. And it was also unsuccessful. Didn't work for them. All it did do, and I fear we may be doing the same, and urging us to intervene, whoever the we may be doing that intervening, all it did do was to hand greater moral authority to Western governments who, over that same 30 years, have done nothing but trash principles of sovereign equality and non-interference and all the rest of it, things that we might like to see defended today. So I'd like to know what's different now. Is this not a very similar discussion, and are not the consequences of it likely to be similar? And I'm also, the other thing that strikes me about that is that there was a tendency to frame it in terms of good versus evil. Once you do that, once you frame your enemy as evil, well, who are you framing as the good guys here?
Okay, thanks. So, So, Frank, would you like to just very briefly, anything you want to pick up?
Well, just on that last point, I was against Western intervention everywhere. Balkans, Libya, Iraq, Syria. I thought I'm an opponent of an attempt to create regime change or to bring democracy. to a particular kind of society. I think the situation in the Ukraine is very different. And I don't think that you kind of want to make a dogma out of non-intervention. Because if you do that, then we lose sight of the fact that there are two important things in play. One is national interest, which is the national interest of most countries in Europe who do not want to see the kind of redivision of Europe that's going to be inevitable. And secondly, when you have a large regional superpower invading Ukraine and in a sense destroying it quite systematically, with all kinds of untold consequences, then what we need to do is to give whatever support we possibly can. And we do that not because that makes us morally better or because it's a way that we can solve our own moral confusions, because that's not going to occur through such an intervention. Well, we do it simply because it's a way that the basic notion of a right of nation to self-determination can be given meaning, and I think that the stakes are very, very different. The world has changed quite dramatically in terms of the balance of power, and the threat that Russia represents in the Ukraine is a threat not just to the Ukraine but to Russia itself, to the possibility of that nation being, in a sense, kind of disintegrating. I think also, just one little final point, the warrior ethos is not about being, very macho and kind of going gung-ho and playing around with rifles. I think it's to do with the fact that we take the defense of our community quite seriously, and we all assume a certain degree of responsibility for the welfare and security of the environment that we live in, and we don't outsource that. We don't outsource that to sort of experts or outsource that to mercenaries or things of that nature. And that's something that historically has been so important, because every society that relied on outsourcing its defense to mercenaries always ended up in a very bad spot.
Okay, thanks, Tim. Anything you want to do?
Yes, first of all, thank you very much for that point about dexterity of mind. I thought that was a very good way of putting it, and I've been concerned that there have been some people who have sort of decided that because the government may not have been wrong about one thing, it's not even wrong about the other thing, but it's lying about it. Never dismiss, by the way, the possibility of there being an economic decision behind that. There are some people who've made a lot of money out of COVID skepticism, and it kind of keeps the thing rolling to move on to the next thing. As regards the issue of NATO expansion, I do feel that we have mishandled Russia in the last 30 years. Feeling that way doesn't mean, however, that because Russia has then turned on the West or upon Ukraine doesn't mean that you don't oppose it. Sure, I feel we have baited the bear, but once the bear attacks you, you respond to the bear. You don't go, fair enough, I was baiting you for a long time. You take a stand against it. On the question of solidarity, well, the government has called our bluff in a wonderfully Tory scheme. They have privatised compassion by saying, rather than local governments looking after, local councils looking after people, you can do it if you feel that strongly about it, and we'll even pay you £350 a month to do it. And as I saw MPs discussing in the comments today, I looked around at all these faces of MPs suddenly realising, oh, I'm going to have to do this. If I don't, I'll get cancelled on Twitter. Finally, on the point about the Archduke, what is the thing that's going to cause the cataclysm? Well, I hope there won't be a cataclysm, but Russia isn't the only problem in play right now. It could have been Russia and Ukraine. It could have been Iran getting the bomb. It could have been China invading Taiwan. There are a number of sort of post-Cold War problems that we've not solved. One thing we're going to have to do is unknit globalization, because it means it limits our room for maneuver for dealing with them. Oh, and finally, very quickly on the point about Putin, no, of course there'll be Russians who agree with Putin. Part of my point is that it's hard to tell. You cannot trust a dictator's word under a dictatorship that he speaks for his country. You just can't rely on it. And my more sort of emotional point is I know so many Russians in this country, some of whom have fled Russia, fled Putin. And I really regret greatly this tide of this feeling of Russophobia in Britain. Russia and Putin are not synonymous, and I really want to hammer that message home.
Okay, thank you. Right, so, Jay.
Yeah, just to respond to a few points. On the question about opposition in Russia, I think the mistake that people always make about Russia is to think that Russians are like us and thinking the same way, and that we can just project, our own sensibilities onto that country, which for reasons of history and national identity and all sorts of other things, people do not see the world in the same way that we do. And I'm afraid that there's some very brave people who've been coming out and protesting against this war in Russia, very brave to do it, because the level now of police terror against those who do it is extreme. You don't get any chances anymore. You're certainly going to get a beating, and you're certainly going to end up in prison. And if you do something else, you can get 15 years in prison. So the people who are, and it's striking how many across many cities, are very brave indeed. But I'm afraid that they are a very small minority, just as all those protests and the founding ones and so on in recent years have been very small. So the majority of people outside of the middle classes who live in the major cities are exposed to state propaganda and state television. That is, they don't have access to social media, and they don't have access to it. Nobody has access to it anymore in Russia. And this is for them. This is how it is. Isolated again, the whole world against them, and it does take a lot for Russians to rise up and protest. But having said that, the miscalculation of Putin, the reason why so many people did not predict this was because Putin knew, and the elite knew, that this would be a very unpopular war. And so there was no preparation for it in terms of the domestic audience at all, as there was before in 2014, before Crimea. It's unpopular for various reasons. I mean, Putin himself is much less popular now than he was then. Just want to look at what happened to the Russian economy since then. Many Russians have family in Ukraine. So many families are actually divided. They have people on both sides, in Ukraine and in Russia. They don't want their sons or brothers going off to fight in Ukraine and to be cannon fodder in this really brutal war. Fatal surprises are what wars are all about, and miscalculations. The leaders who lead their countries into war make fatal mistakes, and the outcome is never what they imagined it to be when they started out. It seems pretty clear to me that Putin thought that this could be done and dusted, and that rested on many miscalculations and underestimation of the degree to which a sense of national identity in Ukraine has actually, for the first time ever, come into being since 2014, actually in a very short period of time. Ukraine is not a democracy. Ukraine is a completely corrupt oligarchic system, an economic basket case. All these people who say, Putin did this because he's seeing this flowering of democracy and economic success next door. What a nonsense. He did this because he thought Zelensky was weak, which he was, very unpopular before this war. This war has been the making of him. In big trouble, actually, under threat from other political interests in the country, oligarchs of various sorts. He thought a comedian, somebody who's very unpopular, and the West is weak. Joe Biden's in power, that pulled out of Afghanistan. So why did he do this now? I think there was a miscalculation there, primarily about Ukraine, more than the West signaled that it wasn't going to fight at all. So I think this war is going to exact a very high price in Russia, and the sanctions. I mean, the sanctions that are in place now are a different order than anything that occurred in 2014. The most important one being the effective sequestration of the international reserves of the Central Bank of Russia and their rainy day fund, sovereign wealth fund.
Okay, thanks. Right, I'm going to take 2 more rounds of questions, and there's a million people who want to speak. Right, that gentleman's got a microphone, so you speak first.
Thank you. Oh, it works. All right, so hi everyone. My name is Fernando and I came here today to share my story with you. I was born in Lisbon. I'm the son of a Portuguese father and a Russian mother. My uncle Nikolai lives in Ukraine, the region of Donbass, in a small town called Alchevsk. He's 63, born in Ukraine, married to a Ukrainian-speaking wife, but his first language is Russian. Nikolai and his family over the last 8 years have suffered from horrible atrocities committed by the Ukrainian government and by far-right nationalist battalions such as the Azov battalion. Things that the Western media completely fails to address. It all started in 2014 when the Ukrainian government started closing Russian-speaking schools and Orthodox churches, prohibited the Russian language from institutions. Russian cultural events such as the Victory Day were shut down. Pensions stopped being paid to citizens of native Russian-speaking regions. And more importantly, native Russian speakers that opposed these measures were met with prosecution, violence, and even murder. The Ukrainian government for 8 years has bombed native Russian-speaking regions that opposed their discrimination, leading to thousands of deaths of innocent children, elderly people, and citizens whose only interest was to speak their native language and practice their traditions. If Ukraine claims to be a Western democracy, why for all this time their non-democratically elected government has failed to represent the needs of native Russian speakers that account to at least over 5 million people?
Thank you very much. And one thing, somebody's got the microphone there. I'm going to go to that gentleman there because there's hand up with the black. And then, afterwards. I just wanted to say something on that, again, to the panel and everyone, because we can't resolve everything tonight. But you made a joke, Frank, about everyone becoming a Ukraine specialist. And it is important that people know what's going on. That was an interesting contribution that gentleman made. And also, Jo, when she was just speaking herself, also made points about Ukraine not being this kind of lovely, happy democracy where you kind of set it up in that way. But is that what? But that when then you wrote that essay that we kind of inspired this event. It's not about the internal stuff on Ukraine at all. There's nothing wrong with knowing all that, but do we understand it through that? And I wanted to just reflect. You're not yet. It's in first, and then you. Right. Anyway, that's it.
Frank made a lot of points about what's happened in the West, and I agree with many of them. But I get concerned when we talk about things like a buffer zone, and we have to have a deterrent, and we have no alternative. Firstly, who's the we? And if you want to rekindle and resuscitate things like commitment, duty, service, loyalty even, surely they can be to principles and to a nation state that advocates peaceful resolution, diplomacy, shines a light for its citizens to take its leaders to task, to stand in solidarity with citizens in Ukraine and with citizens in Russia against their leaders, and surely saying that we have no alternative. It sounds a bit like a domino theory of the Cold War, right? Next here and then China, as though somehow we, and are you saying that now everyone should unite around kind of leaders to stop the end of democratic countries? It's a bit like, I think there's different interests here. And I think that the idea of all these dominoes going down there is dangerous, and also could help amplify the issues that all speakers have said about, which is like increased militarism, and can take a dynamic that you're worried, you're saying you're concerned about happening, but actually can exacerbate it. And surely there's a sense of responsibility that we can challenge our own leaders and inspire others in their countries to do the same. And perhaps it's low horizons to think not. And I think that advocating the militarization of the region even further is very dangerous.
Okay, thank you very much. So that gentleman there.
Hi, Claire. Just as a fellow Brexiteer, love your work. So you, Tim, were saying, what do Indians and Pakistanis think about? You've got more than one. I'm Pakistani, born in Scotland, live in England. I see a very framed discussion. I don't see a debate. Putin's bad and evil. We're good. And I think it's pantomime politics, frankly. I think we're in danger of really simplifying things And we need to really look at ourselves, because what I see is colonialism, Western exceptionalism, and racism. And that's the truth. Trudeau can trample horses, mounted police on his protesters, and no one word of condemnation from any leaders. Money is frozen from those who donated to the Freedom Convoy truckers, and there's nothing said in the Western political world. We, in the last 2 years, have been victims of our governments and our leaders. Our rights have been stripped away from us and are continued to be stripped away from us. But hey, let's move away from the COVID narrative and look at the bad person, Putin. That gentleman spoke some things that really need to be looked at. The Azov Brigade, what's happening in Donbass. If Russia sent a politician to Ireland, Sinn Féin started instigating trouble, handing out cookies to the protesters and trying to cause trouble between Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland. And then the Russians said, yes, the British think it's their backyard. Who do they think they are? Of course it's our backyard. And of course Ukraine is their backyard. If we had lost 30 million people like the Russians did in the Second World War, they would be very sensitive to neo-Nazism, to people encroaching on their borders. So what I would ask you is, rather than having a framed discussion, a lot of eloquent, articulate discussions about the nuances of this and that, but ultimately, Putin's a crazy person, very dangerous talk. He's not. And I'm not standing by Putin. I'm not standing by Ukraine. I'm standing for humanity. We need to have a grown-up discussion and look at ourselves and see what we are doing wrong, because that's not what's being talked about.
Right, so where's the mic on? So oh yeah, there we go. Sorry, somebody's got it. Can you come around here and go right back there? Yes.
Yeah, I'm going to be in Warsaw this week, and we've been organising a series of debates. The one that's coming up on Thursday is called The Sacred and the Profane. Quick plug there, in the museum. We programmed this event well before the invasion of Ukraine, but now the spectre of this is haunting our debate, and will be more I read around it, you know, it's starting to have a greater resonance for me, and that is about Putin's words about the spiritual war that he is instigating. It seems not so dissimilar from Islamism, in my opinion, my personal opinion. He talks about Jerusalem as, Ukraine and Kiev particularly as his Jerusalem, as Russia's Jerusalem. So we haven't really spoken about religion, the role of religion in this war. The Russian Orthodox Church, certainly the leadership, you know, is almost the religious vision for Putin. That's what it seems like to me. Of course, there are priests within the Russian Orthodox Church who are protesting and objecting and distancing themselves from that. But the leadership of the Russian Orthodox Church is not. They are very much shoulder to shoulder with Putin. So this the spiritual dimension that Putin is using in his language, in his metaphors, in his rhetoric. What do you think about that? And then what do we do in the West, where we are this secularist, maybe slightly valueless kind of culture? So that's a question I just want to throw out there.
Okay, thank you. So yes, and then one here, then the panel, then I'm back to try and take everyone. Who's got the microphone? There you are, yes, and then. Yes.
Okay, one brief comment, two questions to the panel or anyone else, and one for our Russian friend here. The comment just struck by Frank's comment about historical amnesia. The number of times I've heard on the radio, on TV, people talking about this is the first war in Europe for 70 years, as though former Yugoslavia in the 1990s is somehow being airbrushed out of Europe. That seems to be the perfect illustration of what you're talking about, historical amnesia. Two questions. One, what kind of settlement does the West offer Russia that can, whether it's a Putin Russia or post-Putin Russia, that can bring some kind of end game to this? What kind of settlement would that look like? Secondly, what's the role of China? Should China be a mediator? Could China be a mediator? Would that be a good thing? And to our friend over here, simply, what would you like to happen now?
Okay, thank you. Right, so with microphone there, I'll take you and then panel. Yes.
Yeah, Frank, I keep what Claire said at the start about this is like work in progress and we're working things out, we're thinking out loud. I think that's a really good point. Can I ask you a cheeky question about all of your theoretical work over the last 30 or 40 years? It's about two things. You've really developed this brilliant politics around rescue the subject, agency, and you're using some of that now when we're trying to talk about Ukraine and the idea we must not be paralysed, we must not just say there's nothing you can do. And it's very interesting. Then the other side of the work is what you might call in old-fashioned words anti-imperialism, that we're against state intervention, and we've always been against it in Iraq and Libya and Afghanistan and Serbia, etc. And my question is, do you see, you're probably going to say no, but I'll think out loud and ask it, do you see a tension between those two elements of your work? Because the way that you presented it today, I understand completely why you might say no fly zones, etc. But then you do have to ask the question, who's the we who's going to do that? And that's going to be the Brits, that's going to be NATO, that's going to be the very countries that bombed all of these other people. And it's not about looking in the past, it's once you give those the legitimacy to intervene in that situation, what happens next year, the year after? Do we effectively give up on that, I think, very honourable tradition that we've built of anti-imperialism and being against state intervention? Now, my problem is this, I sound old-fashioned, I'm obviously Irish, and I'm a great believer in James Connolly. He had a big banner outside Liberty Hall during the First World War. I said, we serve neither king nor Kaiser. And in my old-fashioned way, I stick to that, and I also say neither Washington nor Moscow or London. But I accept that can become dogma. It has to be worked at. And I'm wondering, is there anybody who can help me, like you, Frank? We can maybe work through our anti-imperialism, our opposition to interventionism. And I think if we did that, that wouldn't take us to support the potential of a no-fly zone in Ukraine, because the people who say something must be done, it's tragic. My heart's with the Ukrainian people, but I am one of those people who think there's not a lot we can actually do right now in that situation.
Okay, thanks. Yeah.
You might have to stop looking at Frank and answer.
Yeah. And you can put your hand up and not heckle, because that's the grown-up thing to do. Yeah.
Thanks, Claire. So I found the evening really interesting, but really, really depressing. So whether it's Frank's broad sweep of history or Joan, these steps, why is it depressing? Because it feels like this was something that was hiding in plain sight. And the reason I use that expression, as I'm just going to draw a parallel, I'm going to come back to the point around economics, is that financial crisis, a lot of that was hidden, whereas this feels like it was pretty obvious. So the other reason it's depressing, everybody's focused on militarism, nationhood, culture, values. Nobody's talked about money. Jones mentioned it a little bit. I think the freezing of Russian central bank assets is a massive, massive thing. The one thing the West has, we don't have values, we don't have the balls to fight, but we do have the Western financial system. So the simple question is, can that really be the tool to affect, not regime change, but that's, I think, our strongest weapon.
Okay, thank you. Tim, anything you want to pick up?
Yes, people have made lots of good points that I don't think the fact that they are good necessarily undermines the case for standing by Ukraine. Yes, there is a far right in Ukraine. As we have heard, there probably, I don't know much about it, but there probably has indeed been human rights abuses against people in the eastern part of the country. It is a very corrupt country, and I know there has been a policy of Ukrainization, which has probably had a horrible effect upon people's lives. I also am sympathetic towards those who say that they prefer peaceful resolutions and they are opposed to militarization of the region. And yes, I'm uncomfortable about labeling people as good or bad or indeed evil. Although I would say that in the case of Putin, are we good? Maybe we're not good, but I think we're better. I think we're better. Yeah. And in the case of when this comparison is made between what Trudeau or New Zealand has done to civil liberties in the course of COVID, and then comparing that to Putin's rule, I think the point is that what has happened under COVID has been the exception. And it is the exceptional nature of it that has caused such outrage. It is that a democratic right and a way of life has been upended. That is what has angered me so much. By contrast, in the case of Putin, when he arrests someone for holding up a banner against the war, that's normal.
Yes.
That's the difference between our two systems of life. That's the difference between our systems of life. And finally, on the question of, inevitably, we are at risk of descending into whataboutery and saying, well, look, the West does this, we turn a blind eye to what's going on in the east of the country. How can we possibly feel, is it not imperialism, is it not racism for us to step in and suddenly say, oh, in this instance, we've decided to get involved? Well, think of it like you're living in a city with an appalling crime wave. And you know there's all sorts of crimes being committed at the time, all over the place, right now at this very moment. And you happen to witness a little old lady being mugged. Do you at that point say, well, I could step in, but you know what, there are people being mugged all over this city right now, and I know nothing about her. I know nothing about that old girl. She could be a bank robber or something. She might deserve what's happening to her. And who am I to step in? Because, you know, I passed the odd bum check as well. You don't make those calculations. You act in that moment because you can see it from happening. And one does so for universal human reasons. I am compelled to do so by Christianity because, as St. Paul says, when one part of the body hurts, the entire body feels it. The entire church is in pain. I wish we would do more for other people in other parts of the world outside Ukraine. But this is a problem we can do something about, and we should.
Thank you. Frank, anything you want to pick up then?
Yeah, I think that we need to take a reality check. You know, the idea that we need a peaceful solution rather than a military solution, we don't want to militarize Ukraine, is bizarre. Because Ukraine is so militarized already, that the idea that somehow, you know, we are militarizing it, it doesn't make very much sense at all. I think you also have to recognize that we live in this in a very complex, very unique moment we're in. Let me give you my story. I'm originally Hungarian. I'm really Hungarian, not just originally. And as you probably know, in the Transcarpathian region of the Ukraine, the Hungarian minority, like the guy over there said, is as opposed as section of the Russian minority in the Ukraine. For example, Hungarians are no longer allowed to teach their children in Hungarian language. They're being forced to, you know, teach in Ukrainian. So I'm not very happy with Ukraine at all. I think that in point of fact, when it comes to corruption and oligarchical maneuverings, there's no difference between Russia and the Ukraine, except that Russia has more of them and is stronger. That's the difference. So I'm not unaware of the fact that Ukrainians are not angels, and also that Russians are not the devils. It's a more kind of complicated situation than that. But nevertheless, you know, whatever the situation is in the Ukraine, whatever the past, whatever the oppressive measures taken by the Ukrainian governments towards different kind of minorities, we are confronted with a very simple fact that this country is being invaded by a nation that has got not just simply limited ambitions, but global ambitions. So when you make fun of the domino theory, you know, Russia isn't just simply saying, oh, I want to have this particular region or Ukraine, or that particular region of the Ukraine. Russia has embarked on a project of dividing Europe, basically the reimposition of the Yalta Treaty, but in a new form. And that's something that's of direct interest for me. So the reason why I want to fight back isn't because I'm altruistic, and isn't because I'm you know, I want to democratize the region or I've got some kind of grand project. It's because I actually feel directly threatened. Now, I feel threatened by what's happening in a way that I've never felt all my life, and I got a very long life, because the threat has never been so direct and so immediate. And I'm surprised that other people think of this as something over there and think of it merely in terms of solidarity. It's not that. It's a much more immediate issue that's to do with us in the here. And there's nothing wrong with taking measures in response to your own national interest and in relation to your own survival. And particularly, there's nothing wrong with basically saying, it might sound racist, it might sound whatever, but I do think European civilization, you know, as a European, is really special and it's well worth saving. And given the fact that the European elites are doing such a good job at screwing it up anyway, right? We need to step in there and do whatever we can to put that issue around, because the stakes are very, very high. If European civilization, unravels in the way that it is, it's an issue for the whole world. Not because Europeans are special or unique or whatever, but just simply because there's been a number of cultural and political elements within that civilization that are important for humanity as a whole, as there are in other parts of the world. So I think we should stop thinking in that kind of narrow pedestrian way of what it is like here in Britain. And we should stop thinking, well, who are the we or whatever. The point is, we cannot trust governments and we cannot trust what they're doing. We have to be vigilant. So when I call for a no-fly zone, the main reason why I call for that isn't because I want the British Air Force to kind of fly into action. The reason why I call for that is because we need people in this country to understand that fighting and the need to fight is not something that happened in the past, nor is it something that might happen 500 years from now, but it's an issue that we're confronted with here and now. And one way or the other, we've got to get that message across. Otherwise, we do become almost parasites on the fights that other people are carrying out, the struggles that other people are carrying out in other parts of the world. And that's also the reason why, just one final point, I'm a big fan of trying to organize something that's the equivalent of an international brigade in the 1930s, but to do that in a contemporary form where we encourage people to go to Ukraine and fight, because I think that...
You can do that at the end, right? Because otherwise I'm going to lead. We've got too many people. Right, Joan, and then I'll try and just grab as many of you as possible. I've got you. So, right, Joan.
Yeah, I think it's very hard in this discussion to come up with some compelling argument about what we can do, and I'll come back to that maybe in a minute. I kind of slightly disagree with Frank about Russia having ambitions, really expansionist ambitions that could, take it into the vaults and elsewhere. I think that primarily Russia is a defensive power. That has been the driving force of its foreign policy, which has now led us into this war. It may seem a contradiction, but it's a defensive power, and that's what Tim said about the mishandling of Russia because of hubris, mainly because of in that unipolar moment in the 90s when, after the collapse of the Soviet Union, when Russia was completely prostrate and humiliated, mistakes were made. And I think what that tells us is that Frank's original point about the inability to understand history and the forces of history, and the inability to think strategically or long term, that is what has led us on the Western side to where we were now, because Russia has never been, except for maybe one brief moment, never saw itself as a Western power. But it saw itself as a European power, and its place is primarily in Europe, with an orientation in this direction, not towards China. So Frank is right in that sense that it's, this is not a natural alliance of Russia and China. And, if there had been some really long-term strategic thinking done, they would have seen that Russia was the natural ally in a counterbalancing alliance against China. But it's far too late for all that now. So this is where we are. Vladimir Putin is not crazy. I really disagree with this kind of laziness, approach. It's been actually encouraged in foreign ministries around Europe that he's gone crazy. He is a 19th century thinker. His motivations are these, ideas of, reviving Russia, becoming, returning it to some kind of great power status. You've got its security concerns. Plus, I think what you can see over the past 30 years is the difficulties that Russia has had in letting go of Russians in the former Soviet states, and particularly in Belarus and Ukraine, and letting go of primarily those countries, and still seeing itself as this great power, that calls the shots in its near abroad, and that's certainly been a motivation in his foreign policy. So, but coming back to the question of what kind of a settlement could end this? Somebody asked, what can the West do? Well, it's not up to the West to decide what settlement is acceptable here. It's up to the leaders of Ukraine to decide that. And unfortunately, they're in a really terrible predicament. Because in terms of how this is going to play out, the only scenarios that I see is that, well, there's probably three. One is that Russia finishes what it started with this terrible artillery bombardment, laying siege to major cities. So the attrition, the cost, the human cost of this force the leadership in Ukraine to make a settlement that essentially surrenders control of part of its territory. A defeat, which I don't think can be ruled out for Russia, that it is actually forced back to you can already see the problems of morale and disorganization of this army, and that it could be routed and suffer defeats. Plus, we don't know what's going to happen in Russia itself and the kind of destabilizing impact of these things. Okay, I will stop there.
Part 3 in the summing up. Right, okay. I'm really sorry, everyone. Yes. And then you.
Yeah, just a very, very brief question for Frank. You said 3 times this evening, I think, that there's a danger that Russia might disintegrate, which is a very big claim and maybe true. I know very little about Russia, but if you can explain at least a little bit, if you can flesh out a bit why you make that claim.
Thank you. There. Oh no, you first and then that. Yeah.
I don't buy the introspective and pacifist view that I have come across privately and has been expressed here tonight, that somehow the West, NATO, the EU, or most especially Boris Johnson, were somehow complicit in this invasion. I think our partisanship is defeating objectivity here. Putin invaded because he does not believe that the Ukraine is a country. It's as simple as that. And what behaviour the West exhibited before is not the key reason why that country is now being destroyed. People also say that we shouldn't intervene in any way because it doesn't work. And again, tonight we've heard Iraq, Syria, Libya, Serbia. There have been many interventions that have failed. But some alternative facts, friends. There are many examples where we did not intervene in any way. Rwanda, millions of people died. The Uyghurs, 2 million people in concentration camps. And perhaps most pertinently, Chechnya, 100,000 people dead and the capital destroyed brick by brick. This is a fellow European democracy whose president was elected on 75% of the vote. It is close to us. It is appealing for our help. If ever there was a moment for the left to rediscover its spirit for the international brigades, the medical aid that went in at the same time, and the support for refugees, then now is that moment.
Okay, thank you very much. Yeah.
A number of people have spoken about the internal character of the Ukrainian regime, but it completely misses the point. We're not talking here about a civil conflict. We're talking about an international conflict. And so it begs the question, how in the 21st century should nations relate to one another? And there's a very simple principle at play here, which is that we ought to believe in and support the sovereignty of nations, no matter how big, how small, or how powerful. And that means we support the right of Ukraine to exist. And I think, Joan, you've had a bit of an easy ride tonight because you've said Russia is a defensive nation. It isn't. It started this war, and then you went on to correctly say that Russia, Putin, wants to revive this notion of 19th century great power politics, in which it, as someone else has just said, doesn't think that Ukraine has a right to exist. It is important that Russia gets a bloody nose in this conflict so that we can establish for the 21st century the sovereign equality of all nations upon which you cannot have any democracy or enduring peace without.
Okay, thank you.
Frank, you gave a talk in the summer where you talked about irresponsible elites globally. And you made the point that it's all very well when they're playing around with silly rules about COVID, but when it comes to foreign policy, it gets really dangerous. And here we are. I've thought about that quite a lot since this whole thing has been unfolding, and it does seem that this is a process that is unfolding. Whatever happens is not going to stop at Ukraine, right? And what you've been describing is a situation which you end up having to take sides. The only kind of, I suppose the thing that occurs to me is that you can take sides without just assuming that your side is perfect, right? That taking sides doesn't absolve you of the responsibility of making better arguments and recognising the problems with your own elites, which are considerable. And that's why I'm very glad that you talked about moral rearmament, which is something that I think it'd be really good to have much more of a serious discussion about that than what we tend to read in the press, which kind of is along the lines of, oh, well, war will shake us out of all of our woke values, as though it's just as simple as that. But I think it's quite a difficult discussion to have, but also a very important one.
That's a point, just interestingly, because somebody said to me, how can you support Boris Johnson and Trudeau? And I said, what do you mean? And they said, well, how can you support them after what they've done? They've destroyed our liberties. That's what you're doing if you support Ukraine. And there is quite a lot of people who think like that at the moment, right? Just to say, I condemned Trudeau and I'm no fan of Boris Johnson. It's irrelevant to the point, but anyway, that's right there and then there. Yeah, you speak and it's there.
Well, Frank, I just wanted to see if you could make the distinction between, if you are making a distinction clear enough between supporting something like an international brigade and, throwing your lot in, or it sounds like with, Western leaders. I mean, I've read this Andrew Neil column a few weekends ago that, makes your skin crawl, and he's sort of celebrating the fact that, NATO's back, it's regained its moral dominance, Germany's back on the stage, the EU's found its purpose, Britain's leading the way, hurrah, and you think, oh, Jesus, is that the future that's laid ahead of us? I'm reading Quiet Frozen Dawn by Sholikov at the moment, and it's a bit like eating chicken in Kievs or drinking Russian vodka. You wonder who's watching you on the tube reading a Russian. But there was some, reading that book now and understanding the history of not just solidarity between, Germans and Russians in the trenches, but Ukrainians and the whole, sort of what I'm saying is if we lash up with Western powers in a way that some people have pointed out an anti-imperialist position didn't used to or oppose. I understand what you're talking about, the future if Ukraine is defeated, but what is the future of that kind of alliance as opposed to an international brigade? Because, that in 20, 30 years doesn't look particularly good to me.
Right, there's no chance to take everyone, right? So I'm basically taking about 5 people and some people are leaving because we're over time, right? And we need to go to the pub so we can kind of, chat. Yes, could that microphone come to that yellow person? Not yellow person. Yes.
So I suppose my question, Frank, is whether you accept that a no-fly zone would necessitate a war with Russia. Because if you do, then why talk about a no-fly zone at all? Because so much of the time, people who argue for no-fly zones tend to not explain what that would achieve. And you've talked about the humanitarian corridors. Well, they're not being bombed from the sky, they're being shelled and they're being attacked on the ground. So why not stick British boots on the ground? Why not argue for a war with Russia between NATO and the Russian Federation? That seems to me to be where you're going, which is all very well. I just wonder why you start with the position of a no-fly zone. And I can't see, I thought it was very striking that the people coming in arguing for a no-fly zone almost immediately as this invasion was announced, tended to have sort of the EU flag in their Twitter bio, or the NATO symbol in their bio. And what was interesting was that they weren't arguing from the starting point of national interest. They were arguing as though they needed a war to be able to save face. And they seem to be proceeding on the basis that no matter the consequences, we need some kind of intervention in order to save the reputation of the EU and NATO. And that seems to me to be extremely dangerous. And you may be arguing for that, and John made a similar point that Russia needs to be seen to have a bloody nose. And I can understand that to some extent. But I suppose my end question is, do you see, are you really arguing for an escalation? Can you put it in those black and white terms? Or are you wanting to have your cake and eat it by arguing for a no-fly zone?
Okay, thank you. I can't take you all, so it's just hopeless. Who's got the microphone? No, sorry, you, yes, yeah, you. And then that is to, yeah, you speak.
So Frank, at the beginning you talked about people needing to act in their national interest. I think that's what you were saying. And leaders acting in their national interest. And I just wonder if that's what all nations should do, is act in their own self-interest. As a leader, as a moral leader, how can you do that and not end up behaving as Putin is behaving, which is probably in his national interest? So that was a question for the whole panel. And the second one was, you also mentioned about morally rearming ourselves and what should we do. And I just wondered if a leader from a bygone age, a couple of hundred years ago, whether our morals back then were more obvious to us, that actually that leader wouldn't need to sort of think too hard, or the country wouldn't need to think too hard. They would just act in a certain way that was triggered by their morals and their values.
Okay, thank you very much. That gentleman there. There's a gaggle of people over here who I owe the microphone to, but you're speaking next.
Hi Frank, you talked about the need to kind of deknit ourselves from endless globalization, and I was wondering what you thought of kind of this opportunity of de-engaging from a global oil market and going back to kind of having countries that are much more energy self-sufficient, and whether that's going to be an opportunity in the next few years to really push away from, kind of a fossil fuel market to a, market where countries can produce their own energy renewably.
Yeah, very, very interesting comments. And just on the financial and on the energy thing, that's certain. Those two issues are certainly things that the Academy of Ideas is going to be pursuing in the next period of time. So do look out for specific meetings. Right, Gaggle, you've got the right short, sharp, everyone. Yeah.
Okay, thanks for picking me. A couple things that we've noticed, all of us, that we've seen incredible amounts of division, tribalism, and separation. And social media has played a big role in that. You can't have a voice anymore. Everybody needs to realize and take a step back, and cooler heads will prevail. But freedom of speech is absolute. If you don't like somebody's opinion, you don't have to listen to it. Now, as far as groupthink, that's too much of a feature. It seems like due process and the rule of law has been abandoned in favor of mob rule on Twitter. It's the central bank had sovereign immunity that was disregarded. Civil asset forfeitures are a feature, and the politicians haven't done anything. And the other issue that we have to get into is that why politicians are no longer trusted. They've run our economy into a ditch since the credit crisis. This is something I know a lot about. Okay, we're seeing two pounds per liter for gas. It can triple or quadruple, and inflation is around 16%.
Okay, thank you. So I'm sorry to keep stopping you. Yeah, you two and you there, and then there. I think that'll probably be it. There might be one more. Yeah.
Okay, just very briefly. There's a relationship here that I'd like the panel to tease out if they possibly can, and that's the relationship between civilization, geopolitics, and history. Because Frank talks about the revenge of history, the return of history, but then also says it never went away. I always thought history was simply what we did, but civilization seems to be this immutable, monolithic thing. Are we living with the fallout of Huntingdon? Is Dugin simply reheated Huntingdon? And was he always right? And if he was wrong, doesn't that make the stand for national self-determination, national sovereignty all the more important? But that's a fundamentally Western idea. And it's fundamentally then Western civilization that we seem to be defending here.
Okay, thank you. Yeah.
I think the people that are making the point about, Ukraine is not the full shilling or that it's corrupt or whatever, aren't really, the test of Ukraine is now. So, if Ukrainians had just said, oh yeah, sure, come govern us, then it wouldn't have been an issue. But the fact that they're fighting plainly shows us that this is a question of self-determination. That seems to me the thing, so when we talk about imperialism, that word seems a bit,
inappropriate, or maybe it is appropriate. It's just you're looking at the wrong imperialism. What I found that is disturbing, really, I suppose, is when we're talking about the warrior's honour and the the getting in touch with history and the tradition. The only people I hear talking that way are in Russia. It's got like a sort of Alexander Dugin kind of a, and you're thinking, well, are they the only people like believing themselves enough to say, screw you, or I'm trying to be polite, but and are essentially, indifferent to other people's national self-determination, except, they just see their own thing. Whereas in, Zelensky's, maybe this is all kind of Western-oriented kind of propaganda, but he seems a much more kind of globalist George Soros type of a guy. So in that sense, maybe, the Russians are pretty much winning this war in that sense, as you outlined it, of who's got the cojones to do it.
Interestingly, Eric Kaufman's got an article in on Her today making the point that quite a lot of people say, well, at least Putin's fighting woke politics and identity politics. And there is a bit like, anyway, yeah, go on.
I think trying to get your head around this is showing that we've not really got the language to deal with it very well. So I get the point that Frank's making about, there's a fight on, why don't we fight? Dealing with the kind of cowardice that exists more broadly in society when it comes to the crunch, which you are facing, and realising that the Ukrainians' fight is our fight. That their fight is the fight that we need to understand. And it is about national self-determination. It is about, the right to exist, the right to determine who you get as your own leader, whether they're a nutcase or not, it doesn't matter. Whether they're corrupt or not, it doesn't matter, because you deal with it, not somebody else. And that's been a bit lost completely. But then the kind of trying to second guess why Putin does what he does, why Russia does what they do at the moment, means that we don't really have a sense of what power means today and how it works. And unless we get that, we can't do anything about it. And I slightly want to say that to wish somebody would start a no-fly zone is to think, well, where's the power? Where does that power come from? I get the international brigade, that's us. We can stand up and do it. I do not get the no-fly zone, because you're asking the very people who are liable to cause an utter catastrophe because they have no clue about what they're doing to pursue something to the nth degree.
Right. These are like sentences, right? I've got you. Right, that's it. Yeah.
I'm just wondering if the panel could think about the possibility of why wouldn't the West put an oil embargo or, refuse to take Russian oil, because that seems to be one of the most powerful sanctions you could apply, and yet we're not discussing it at all. I mean, it seems to me to have the equivalent potential of a no-fly zone, and yet, we'd all have to suffer a little bit, obviously, with our price of petrol and oil and so on, but nobody's prepared to think about it.
Okay, yeah. Oh, sorry, yes, and then, yeah.
Me? Okay, thank you. Okay, I'll try and be quick.
Got to be one sentence, right? Go on.
Right, I don't think we've had an imperialist war over the last few decades. What we've had, Western countries going into hot wars of their own cultural identity politics. What we face in Ukraine, I think, is a question of working out what is our national interest. I'm not Hungarian, Frank, so to me, I must admit 2 weeks ago, it wasn't immediately obvious what our national interest was. But the question of moral authority that the gentleman at the front raised, I think, is really crucial. And to me, at the end of the day, it comes down to what are you prepared to die for? Because if we can't begin to answer that, then we won't really know how to live properly. And the question of morality is, I think, linked to the question of democracy. Now, you may say, as the last gentleman said, and lots of people say, well, why are you backing this buffoon Johnson? Why would you trust them to do anything positive? But that doesn't matter. He's a
Right,
buffoon.
the
He's been
sentence is now
elected.
gone on and Tim has to go. Right,
To be
okay.
elected.
You've got one sentence, Tim then speaks, then, yeah, go on.
If Russia is such an existential threat to us, why stop at no-fly zones? I mean, I completely understand the logic of you, but if war is inevitable, isn't like a no-fly zone just a pause?
Okay, thank you. That was brief. Thank you, everyone. Sorry to those I didn't get in. First of many discussions. Tim, give us your final thoughts, please.
Yeah, sorry, I've got to go and collect my dog. I think the first person to mention the idea of a no-fly zone in the House of Commons was Tobias Ellwood, and there was a plaintive cry from the press gallery of "No!" and it was me. And the reason why I say that is because A, I'm terrified of nuclear war. Totally open about that. I think that's not something we should be all warrior code about. It's a terrifying prospect that no one wins from. And second, if the argument being placed by the government, whether you think Putin's crazy or not, the argument of the government is that Putin is insane. And if the argument is that he is insane, then why would you push him into a corner by imposing a no-fly zone that internationalizes the conflict and, if anything, encourages him to step up the kind of weapons he's using? So I'm against it for a mixture of practical and entirely, I think, rationally cowardly reasons. Someone asked the question, someone said something about Iraq. I'm actually struck by how little Iraq has been mentioned in the whole conversation about this. I don't know if that's because we've moved on, but I think it's more likely because actually this is Russia's Iraq. It's not our Iraq. There's no threat of it being our Iraq. It's actually Putin that's done it, which is a nice reminder that other countries can make imperialist mistakes as well. And some people argue, of course, you should let them get on with it. I don't agree with that. But nonetheless, they are the ones who have made an error here. And this reminds us that other societies can be decadent. We talk about Western decadence, I talked about it, but actually Russia is an incredibly decadent society because it is run essentially by criminal gangs. And that's one reason why it's found itself in this situation. Finally, the question of what is it we are willing to fight and die for. I don't know. But sometimes history forces you to make a choice. And when I think about the international brigades in the 1930s, it would probably disappoint some of my right-wing friends for me to say that I would unquestionably have been on the side of the international brigades. Yeah. With the awareness that there were Stalinist murderers involved in it, that it was highly divided, and it lost. It was a failed cause. Nonetheless, sometimes you look at something and you look at it and you think, I know the right side. I feel it in my gut. And in this instance, I have no doubt Ukraine deserves what we call international solidarity. Thanks very much.
Thanks very much, Tim. If you need to sneak off your dog duties, then that's fine. But thank you very much for that. Joan?
Yeah, in case I didn't make it clear right at the beginning, but I think I did. I'm completely on the side of Ukraine. The war is an abomination, and we need to stand up for the principle of self-determination, which has been trashed in so many instances over Brexit, over a whole series of Western interventions over many years. We need to stand up for that. The question is how, Frank? So, we do need a hands-off Ukraine international solidarity campaign. What can we do? I'm much more in favour of the idea of an international brigade than the no-fly zone, because the logic of your position, Frank, which is the question that I think it was Luke at the back asked, is that to enforce a no-fly zone, you have to take the fight to Russia. You have to take out their S-300 missile systems, which are in Belarus and Russia, which can shoot down any jets, Western jets, that try to enforce a no-fly zone, which have to refuel every 2 hours, which will be sitting ducks. So you have to do that first before you can think that you can enforce a no-fly zone. So that maybe that's not the best thing. So what are the other things? Are we in favour of punitive sanctions that are going to hit Russian people and put them out of their jobs? Or would we like to go down more the road, of maybe an embargo on Russian oil and gas? So there's no point taking away half the reserves of the Russian central bank if the European Union is sending 1 billion euros every single day, which is what is happening, to Russia at the moment for Russian oil and gas. So that is the question which is still being debated in the EU. Obviously, the US has already done that. And that is the first crack in the kind of transatlantic alliance on this question of how to prosecute this war against Russia. I would rather that we try and think a bit more imaginatively about solidarity that mobilizes ordinary people rather than asking NATO to enforce a no-fly zone or to take some other kind of military action. So if we want to, if the end game is to kind of restore some sense of the need to fight for some things, that some things are worth fighting for, I think that's the way to go.
Okay, thank you very much, Jen.
If the Western world hadn't signaled that the simple fact that no matter what Russia does in the Ukraine, they're not going to do anything about it militarily, Russia would not have invaded Ukraine. That's the story. Russia invaded the Ukraine because they knew that this was a risk-free sort of enterprise. The door was open for them by the behavior of the West. And that's something that we have to deal with and understand now. Even though we are not the governments, we didn't make those kinds of decisions. That's the first point. The second point is that this war is not between Russia and the Ukraine. It's not just between two nations and they can decide one way or the other. I think where John is a little bit wrong is in imagining that just because Russia is a defensive power, and it is a defensive power, it's not therefore going to be very aggressive. History shows us that very often the more defensive you are as a power, the more likely that you're going to lash out, but more importantly, the more you're likely to unleash a chain of events which will not end at the border of Ukraine. And what I see happening, no matter what happens in the war, is that chain of events has already unleashed. Things are going to go, you cannot put the genie back in the bottle, no matter what happens, because both Russia itself, which has become extremely fragile, but also the rest of the world now thinks very differently. NATO is not strong. NATO has not rediscovered its purpose. NATO is a kind of empty zombie organization that momentarily can do certain kind of things, but it has no real sense of purpose that it might have had in the Cold War era. The European Union is not any more unified today than it was a year ago or 10 years ago. The differences of interest have really come out, with Germany being quite clear about what it was. You all heard the Prime Minister of Holland go on record and say that whatever you guys think, Ukraine will not join the European Union. Right? So don't think for 1 second that anything has changed as far as these organizations are concerned. And therefore, it seems to me that the issue at stake for us is not to somehow invigorate NATO or invigorate the European Union or even expect anything good to come out from what they are doing, but to recognize very, very clearly that there's an existential struggle that is going on here. It's already been put in place, and unless we understand the geopolitical sort of stakes in a world that is being redivided in front of our eyes as we speak, unless we take that on board, we're going to be in big trouble. And we have to think more creatively and understand that whether we like it or not, military options, including putting boots on the ground, in whatever form that is possible, is going to have to happen anyway. And the question is, do we wait? Do we basically kiss Czechoslovakia goodbye and say, well, there isn't going to be anything more going on after this, or do we wait until another Poland gets invaded and basically realize that we actually screwed up? We waited a little bit too long, because the longer we wait, the longer we allow this process to continue without somehow morally rearming ourselves and taking matters seriously, the more we are going to be implicated and going to be seen by history as essentially wonderful commentators and observers, rather than people who take their agency and their action a little bit more seriously.
Okay, thank you very much. If you want to join the International Brigade, Frank is doing a kind of stall at the next meeting, right? The Academy of Ideas it's now to be recorded. The Academy of Ideas has not launched an international brigade tonight, right? You might want to watch it. However, thank you actually for some very thoughtful contributions from across the board on the panel and from the audience. I would like to encourage you to support Rick for sending the van on Friday, any help that you can give him, look at your leaflets. But what the Academy of Ideas will do, even if it's not an international brigade, is it is determined to try and dig deeper into this issue and all of the issues that it throws up. So our Battle of Ideas Festival is on the 15th and 16th of October, and I hope we'll see you at it, and early bird tickets are available. But we will also try and have as many discussions before that. And in the most immediate sense, we're going to the Marquis of Cornwallis, which is on Marchmont Street, round the corner from the Brunswick Centre. It's actually really close, but I've got no sense of direction. I won't be joining the International Brigade because it would lead to defeat, basically. Anyway, can we thank everyone and thank yourself for this. Oh, we've got Letters on Liberty on sale on the way out, right? New ideas around to fight for freedom.
Gareth, what do you say?